Okay, friends, let's talk about total cost. All right. So the two prices I gave you in the last video were the purchase price of the bulb and then the cost it took to run the bulb per hour. I give those, we can call them that, that's totally fine. The first one's fine, purchase cost or whatever. It's also got a more traditional kind of name. It's called a fixed cost. And the other one, the cost per hour, because it depends on how many hours you run the bulb, we call that a variable cost. Now, just so you know, there are other kinds of costs besides these two, depending on what you're talking about. There can be maintenance costs, there can be depreciation costs, there's all kinds of stuff that, depending on what you're talking about. But for the purposes of our illustration with these light bulbs, there's really only two costs you have to deal with. I know some of you are thinking, well, there's also a replacement cost. What if the bulb burns out? I promise we'll get to that later. That is another cost. Technically, it's another fixed cost because you'd have to buy the bulb a second time, which would technically make it also a variable cost. But let's get to that. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, I promise. Now, I'm going to put total cost down here again too. Total cost. So the total cost is going to be made up of a fixed cost plus a variable cost. But what I want to chat about too is this variable cost. And we mentioned earlier that the reason it's called a variable cost is because it is dependent on a variable. And the variable in this case, if you think about the unit, dollars per hour, it's the per variable, per hour. So if you think about variable cost, maybe a better way of thinking about it would be total cost equals a one-time fixed cost. That in and of itself doesn't change its value based on anything, it's just what it costs. Plus a variable cost times that number of hours. Because if you think about the unit on that cost, it's dollars per hour, or very small fractions of dollars per hour. So really, the fixed cost is the same, the variable cost will depend upon the number of hours. And if you remember back from earlier math classes, that's going to be called your independent variable. As a matter of fact, I got a feeling some of you are sitting there going, this kind of looks like something I learned either in Math 98, if you had that with me, maybe even in previous math classes. You might be noticing something like variable cost kind of sounds like something I used to call slope, because it depends on an independent variable. So you might recognize this. Some of you might be sitting there going, oh, this is y equals mx plus b. I wrote it the other way around, but it doesn't matter. Y equals mx plus b, or b plus mx. That's why this thing is linear. This thing is linear because that number of hours counts linearly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And there's nothing done to that. It's simply just that number of hours times the variable cost. This is the part, not that you have to memorize this by any stretch of the imagination, but this is the part that makes it linear. So that's why these things are called linear models. They end up being a linear relationship of the variable cost and the fixed cost, but the variable cost is dependent on that number of hours. We'll see a visual of the linear cost in 2 videos. What I'd like to do next, though, is I want to go find a bigger chalkboard to deal with this this cost equation, and I want to look at how it relates to our particular light bulbs. So we'll see you outside at a bigger chalkboard.